Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of The History Blokes, the podcast where we talk about strange stories, fascinating people, and interesting facts from Australia's past. I'm Chris McComb.
And I'm not. I'm Conan.
And we're coming to you today from, and always in fact, from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. And it's great to be with you again. This is the second episode of our rebirth after the long time away.
Yeah, that's the terrible drought that our listeners had to endure. And
what are we listening to today?
What we're looking at today is that literary pioneer, Miles Franklin.
Not Miles Davis.
Is that who you thought we'd be talking about? The famous Australian jazz.
My intermission here is all about jazz in the 1930s Australia. That's fine.
No, Chris is being hilarious. He's not. We communicate better than that, Chris. We're a well-oiled machine.
I got the memo.
Yes. Yeah, so Miles Franklin. Why are we doing Miles Franklin? Because she was a literary pioneer, of course. Not only as a woman writing, but because she was also a trailblazer as an Australian author generally. She was writing around the time of Federation, as Australia created itself, and she was writing in a very Australian way, in a very Australian setting.
Yeah, absolutely. A bit of a game changer, really. And of course, I don't want to get in the way of any questions that may be part of the quiz, but of course we have the award named after her.
Yes. Well, okay. Good on you. But that was one of my questions.
Oh,
Australia's
damn it!
Most prestigious literary. Well, good. I mean, it was a bit of an easy question.
Yeah, it was.
There are. Yes, it's the Miles Franklin Award, of course. So you've got one of the questions right. Let's go for another one. Who was the only Australian to win the Nobel Prize for Literature?
Bryce Courtney.
Bryce Courtney. Oh dear.
I don't have any idea, God damn it.
No, that's evident. Patrick White in 1973.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, he was a seminal figure in Australian letters. Bit grumpy.
Really? Okay.
Not a lot of fun to be around.
Yeah, okay. So he's a man in kind of middle-aged that, was trying to find outlets.
Yeah, exactly.
Wasn't able to take it out in the podcast.
That's right. And Australian letters is better for it.
Brilliant.
Thank God there were no podcasts back then. So, relatively easy question. What's Norman Lindsay most famous for?
Painting, of course.
Yeah. Well, okay. What book? As this is a literary episode, children's book.
Yeah. Oh, hang on. It's on the tip of my tongue.
The Magic Pudding.
No way. He was a Magic Pudding.
I loved it as a kid. I think I read that before. I immigrated to Australia when I was 10, and I think I'd come across it before then. I think my mum might have introduced me to it.
I've certainly read it, and I've always wanted a Magic Pudding. Yeah. To this day, I think about that pudding, and I think,
it's quite delectable.
I could do it. With custard?
Yeah. Oh. But he was a grumpy bugger, wasn't he?
He was actually. He was particularly grumpy. Yeah.
Ornery.
Yeah, indeed.
That's not a word we use enough. So, what Booker Prize winner wrote Oscar and Lucinda?
Oh, my God, I have no idea. This is not a space I'm familiar with.
No, this is.
I feel like a goose.
This is embarrassing for you.
It is.
Peter Carey.
Heard of these people? I know nothing about them.
Who wrote Schindler's List? Oh my God.
I don't know.
I think this is your worst performance yet.
This is horrible. Could he maybe hit me with some Stephen King novels? Anything.
Thomas
some Pulp
Keneally,
Fiction.
of course, wrote that. So I think that brings us to 5 in total. So let us embark, Chris, upon Miles Franklin. Miles Franklin was obviously a pseudonym, given that she was a woman, which from our last episode I was impressed to note that you knew.
Indeed.
But do you happen to know her actual name?
Isn't it part of her name? Miles Franklin is part of her name, a middle name or something, right?
Yes. Yes, that's
I
right.
don't know.
No. Well, I mean,
Sarah?
Oh, good. I mean, that's...
Are you serious?
That's not quite it. But that's only because Sarah was another one of her middle names. So her full name was Stella Maria Sarah Miles Franklin.
Wow, what a wonderful name, in all honesty. That's fantastic.
Let's set the context. She was writing in the 1890s when she was quite young. It was a decade of turmoil in Australia. It was characterised by depression and strikes. And it was also the worst drought that Australians had experienced since European settlement. So it was a sort of perfect storm of economic horror. And it was also a period of social change. So nationalism was on the rise. Obviously, this was the period where there were various referendums being held to determine whether or not Australia should federate.
I mean, we've kind of covered a little bit of this period in a couple of different podcasts. We've dipped in and out of this particular period, haven't we?
Yeah, and if we were more rigorous, we would examine it in some detail. But that's not going to happen. I have actually been given some thought to doing an episode on federation, but I'm not going to do it. Because, I don't... like I like repurposing material.
Indeed
I don't have that
Indeed
material. But also, I looked into it, and I mean...
Is it actually that exciting?
It's not. It's a bit dry.
Yeah.
It's obviously hugely significant in our history, but it's basically just a bunch of meetings, referendums, and I think I tuned out as I researched it, frankly. So I've abandoned that.
We appreciate you giving it a good, honest go, though. Thank you, Conan.
And I like the fact you're using the royal we now, Chris. Social attitudes were slowly changing. Women were demanding and getting better education, and their work prospects were slowly improving too. In 1894, women won the vote in South Australia, and we've looked at women's
Indeed we have.
enfranchisement, and it was among the first jurisdictions in the world to do this. And after the year My Brilliant Career was published, women became enfranchised at the federal level too. My Brilliant Career being, of course, the book that made her famous. Her first book to be published, and that was published in 1901.
And it was turned into movies. I remember watching it as a child.
Back in the 78 or something?
Yeah.
Which was a sort of heyday of Australian film.
I think so. I think so. All the Rivers Run and... Oh my God.
Don's Party, Picnic at Hanging Rock.
Yeah, that's right. And they're all kind of set turn of the century, weren't they?
Breaking the Rants.
Yes, of course, yeah.
And Gallipoli, set obviously a bit later.
Yeah.
Peter Weir at his finest, apart from Master and Commander.
Peter Weir did Master and Commander.
Yeah.
I did not know. That's incredible.
He's a very fine filmmaker.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that we saw Judy Davis and who's the New Zealand actor in My Brilliant Career? Jesus, he was in Jurassic Park.
Oh my God, Sam Neill.
Sam Neill.
Sam Neill. Sam Neill. Yeah.
So books written by young women striving for more empowered identity were being published with greater frequency around this time. But My Brilliant Career was perhaps the best of these, and the only one that still lingers in the national consciousness, really. So a little bit about Miles Franklin. Well, we call her Stella, because that was her name. So she was born in October 1879, and she was the eldest of 7. That's a bit like you, isn't it, Chris? You're one of 5?
I'm 3 of 4.
3
yes,
4?
3 of 4. Sorry. 4 children, thank you.
So she was born in a place called Old Talbingo, which was the homestead of her maternal grandmother in the Monaro region of New South Wales. So
nearby.
Nearby.
Wow.
Not a bad place. It's pretty around there. It's a bit chilly. Because you were raised in Cooma?
Cooma, that's right, yeah.
For part of the time?
Yeah, it was very chilly there too, absolutely. Nice town. I recommend anyone who's travelling through that part of the world stop in and get yourself a sandwich.
Okay. They've got a good pie place there.
They do. And sit in the lovely park and have a look at all the various bits and pieces about the Snowy River hydro scheme whilst you're in Cooma.
Oh, it's got a museum there, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right. A little kind of display.
We should do an episode on that, but I'm not.
We should.
I'm not going to stop. Yeah, that could be you. Why don't you do that?
No, I've got another idea.
Now, so the first 10 years of her life were pretty carefree. She was living in quite affluent surroundings, either at Old Talbingo or on her parents' farm in the Monaro, where she was educated by a private tutor. But when her family were forced to move to a small drought-ridden dairy farm near Goulburn, life became more difficult, and her education suffered. And she was sort of forced to do, a lot of labour on the farm itself.
A lot of dairy-related activities.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think, it was pretty hard yakka. But nonetheless, she read voraciously. And during that time, she wrote My Brilliant Career when she was only 19.
Is that right?
Yeah. Like all first novels, it's semi-autobiographical.
Yeah.
So it's really very similar to her life. And so when she says it was My Brilliant Career, that's an ironic reference. And she wrote it in basically 6 months, mostly in the evenings, after her many farm chores were complete. So,
brilliant. I mean, that's pretty tough work.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You're out there all day slogging it out and, heavy physical labour and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Then to actually have the energy.
Rounding up heifers and whatnot.
100%. Have the energy to sit down and pen your novel. I mean, that's just brilliant, dare I say. I mean, that's very impressive.
I've been in a position where I was wooing a young lady who lived on a farm in the central west, New South Wales. And her brothers thought it would be amusing to encourage me to jump into a pen full of sheep. And they said, "May I just grab a sheep for us, will you?" And I thought this could be a unique experience.
And there's no way they'd be doing it to make you look like a goose.
Exactly. They found it very funny because it was such a sea of sheep. They were all sort of corralled into this pen, and I jumped in. I thought, you just grab them right. You just rugby tackle them, don't you? And then I was just sort of doing various tackles, lunging around the place. I was just covered in dirt and sheep crap. I wasn't getting any sheep.
And the purpose of wrestling that sheep, did they explain that?
No, they might have. It was a while ago. They might have said we need it for jumbucking or for whatever it is.
There was a tucker bag sitting nearby. They needed something done with that.
They might have deployed farm speak, bamboozled me. We got it. So I said, sure. When in Rome, but I didn't succeed, and they laughed. But also, I think it helped break the ice a bit because they thought, well, he's clearly an idiot, but he's prepared to get his hands dirty.
Yeah, and he's kind of funny.
So Stella created and the main character was called Sibylla Melvin. So she created in Sibylla this sort of rebellious, tortured, effervescent heroine, a fascinating character who was modelled closely on herself. So just so we know what the hell we're talking about here, I'll just give you a quick summary of the plot, because I assume you've not read it, Chris, have you?
Correct.
Yes, I did read it when I was first researching this many years ago. And it's good. It's not one of those sort of, you'd think it might be a bit overrated, but it actually is really compelling.
She writes really well, even at that age.
Yeah, she writes, it's a very fresh, original style. And what it really does effectively is it captures that era and it captures that place really, really well. So you can very much imagine you're there. And it's quite charming. So Sibylla, as I say, imaginative, headstrong girl growing up in rural Australia in the 1890s. Drought and a series of poor business decisions by her father reduce her family to a sort of subsistence level, and the father begins to drink heavily. Sibylla struggles to deal with the monotony of her regional life, but to her relief, she is sent to live on her grandmother's property, where life is more comfortable. And there she meets a wealthy young Harold Beecham. Now, Harold Beecham is a completely fictional character. It's not based on anyone. Who falls in love with her and proposes marriage.
The Sam character.
Yes, exactly, yeah. So, convinced of her ugliness and aware of her tomboyish ways, Sibylla is unable to believe that he could really love her. By this time, her father's drinking has plunged the family deeply into debt. And so she is sent to work as a governess for the family of an almost illiterate neighbour to whom her father owes money. So he basically uses her to pay off the debt. And she finds life there unbearable and eventually suffers a kind of physical breakdown, which leads her to return to the family home. And when Harold Beecham returns to ask Sibylla, he goes away or something, to marry him, she concludes that she would only make him unhappy, and she sends him away. And in fact, at one point, I think she hits him in the face with a whip.
It's a rom-com without the com,
yes.
Isn't it?
But I mean, but romance it's not central to it. I mean, he's there, he's a character, but you wouldn't describe it as a romance by any stretch, because their relationship is so tortured, and she is so convinced that marriage isn't for her, or that she isn't really suitable for him. Yeah, it's a feature, but not really a defining feature. Anyway, she decides never to marry in the end. And in fact, Stella herself doesn't marry throughout her entire life. She lived to a reasonable age, never married.
No kids,
no
marriage. So the prodigy of the Franklins did not continue. Not through her. Not through her, yes, obviously. Yeah. Only the other 6 siblings.
Yeah. Now, in 1899, Franklin submitted their manuscript to various Australian publishers, all of whom rejected it. But in desperation, she sent it to the famous bush poet Henry Lawson, who immediately recognised its worth. And he arranged for it to be published by an Edinburgh publishing company. So again, the publishing company in Australia was...
Back to old Blighty to get the thing published.
Now, I don't know if that was how common that was. I suspect it was fairly common. There presumably was an Australian publishing industry of sorts, but obviously that would have been operating at a colonial level. Each colony might have had its own sort of... So while he was in the UK, he arranged to get it published. So it was ultimately published in April 1901 under the male pseudonym, obviously, Miles Franklin. However, Lawson, recognising that no one would be fooled blew her cover in the preface. So he said...
It blew her cover
Yeah.
on page 1.
Yes.
I love it.
This is what he said in the preface. I hadn't read 3 pages when I saw what you will no doubt see at once, that the story had been written by a girl. That was my emphasis. I'm sure he didn't mean it in a despairing way. And as I went on, I saw that the work was Australian, born of the bush. The descriptions of bush life and scenery came startlingly, painfully real to me. And I know that as far as they're concerned, the book is true to Australia, the truest I ever read. There you are. Yeah, so, I think that's, and I mean, I agree. I mean, I can't compare it to other books that were written around that time. I haven't read them, but, yeah, as I said, she really brought the bush to life and what it was, When Coppage reached Australia in September, she was 21 and still living with her parents on their struggling farm without any better prospect in sight. But the book was the literary event of 1901. As such, it opened many doors for her. She travelled to Sydney, where she met the poets Banjo Paterson and Joseph Furphy. Does that name ring a bell?
It does ring a bell, yeah.
And she also met Rose Scott, who is a social reformer in Sydney, as well as Vida Goldstein, a Melbourne feminist. So she was mixing in these circles. Now, this is what a literary critic in the Bulletin wrote of My Brilliant Career. It is the very first Australian novel to be published. Her book is a warm embodiment of Australian life, as tonic as bush air, as aromatic as bush trees, and as clear and honest as bush sunlight. That's nice.
That's very uplifting, I think. Brilliant.
And the timing of it was crucial, because as the book so powerfully resonated with an Australia growing more confident in its identity, it chimed, I guess, with Australians broadly and with young female Australians.
Yeah, no, I think that's great.
Though it's very much a first novel, My Brilliant Career is, as I said, it's consistently well written, it's compelling, it's passionate, and it's very readable. It also captures the very specific vernacular and mood of rural Australian life at the time. And she received many letters from young women who were in a similar situation to her, all aching for a form of freedom that had been denied them. So this is a quote from My Brilliant Career. It came home to me as a great blow that it was only men who could take the world by its ears and conquer their fate, while women, metaphorically speaking, were forced to sit with tied hands and patiently suffer as the waves of fate tossed them hither and thither, battering and bruising without mercy.
That's a great line. I really like it. That's really quite a powerful line.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
great.
and you can imagine how completely accurate that was. It still is to some extent.
She was literally busting out to take the world by its ears.
Yeah, and she did, as we will discover. We'll find out a little bit more about the rest of her adult life after the intermission.
Brilliant. Just got one question, though. When does Miles Davis appear?
Miles Davis is about to appear now, because aren't you devoting the...
Yeah, that's right. Okay, here we go.
But I think you should just play the trumpet.
So, jazz aside, I'm actually going to talk about something that is genuinely on topic. It is literature.
Yep.
And I'm going to tell you the story of Ern Malley. Have you heard of Ern Malley?
I have heard of Ern Malley, yes.
Okay, I won't...
Great man. You should do a quick, for your next intermission, Chris, if you want to quiz me.
I will hit you with a quiz.
That's only fair.
At our next one. Okay, so let's just go back to the 1940s. A time of great change in the world of poetry. And Australia being very much kind of stuck in the Henry Lawson poems, you know what I mean? The stories about the bush. And, very, very Australiana. Meanwhile, the world was evolving, and there's a strong focus on modernism, both in painting, in poetry, avant-garde sort of stuff. And some of the folk at the time that were leading the charge on this was a gentleman by the name of Max Harris, who was Adelaide-based. He was a poet, and he was a co-editor of a modernist art and literature journal called Angry Penguins. Okay, and in many ways they were trying to be that bleeding edge of modernist, the introduction of modernist poetry in Australia. They ran this journal for a while, and in 1943, Harris received a letter from someone called Ethel Malley of Croydon, New South Wales. And Ethel wrote this quite endearing story about her brother Ernest, or Ern, as he's known, who died a little while before, after many, many months of illness, at the tender age of 25. And sometime after his death, she was working through his things and found some of his poetry and thought, that actually looks pretty good. I'm going to send this to Angry Penguins and just see what they think. certainly Ethel's view was this stuff is really different, really quite strange.
It was modernist.
But very much resonating with the modernist view of the world. So, of course, Harris shared the poem with his co-editor, John Reed, and they thought the poems were brilliant, right? They thought the poems were so good and so out there, they decided to dedicate an entire edition to Malley's poetry. And indeed, Sidney Nolan, his artwork was on the cover.
I've kissed one of his paintings.
What?
I'm not proud of it.
You kissed one of his paintings?
Yeah, I was thinking, should I lick it?
Was it the Ned Kelly series?
It was one of the Ned Kelly series.
Oh, wow.
I know. I'm really ashamed.
Oh, my God. Okay, I'm sorry. We're going to have an intermission in the intermission. Please tell me more, Conan.
I don't want to get too specific about names, but...
It was only kissing, though, first base.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't want to in any way damage it, but I... So these paintings and some Brett Whiteley's and stuff were on display at a person's home. These paintings came with the job. This guy was appointed in a senior position for this particular organisation, and one of the perks of the jobs, apart from the massive salary, was that you were given, from the organisation's collection, a stack of Whiteleys and Nolans and God knows what else, which you could put up in your house. So I was also over there, and I was sort of wandering around, and I went into the dining room, and they had all these Nolans. I thought, this is insane. Why does this guy get to have dinner next to Nolans? And I was young and foolish, so I thought, well, as an act of mild rebellion, I will
make out with a painting.
It wasn't French kissing, Chris. It was just... I thought, well, this is the only chance in my life I'm going to get to make physical contact with a famous painting. And I didn't want to touch it with my fingers because of the oil, and I thought just a slight peck is my way of sticking it to the man, but at the same time not really desecrating in any way.
Just a little peck, just on the cheek, or was it lip?
On the bottom right-hand corner. There we are. And what better place to admit that than on a podcast?
Thanks for sharing. So anyway, Sidney Nolan actually painted the cover of this magazine inspired by one of Ern Malley's poems, which I think is brilliant. I mean, this is saying something now. This is getting serious, quite clearly. So Harris wrote as an introduction to the edition outlining Malley's short life and untimely death, as described by his sister in the letter. And he wrote in that introduction, I am firmly convinced that this unknown mechanic and insurance peddler is one of the most outstanding poets that we have produced here in this country. It was quite a splash. It was big news in the poetry scene because this stuff was really pushing the boundaries. But kind of within a couple of weeks, it emerged that Ern Malley wasn't real. Suspicion arose because Harris and Reed were aware of people trying to make them look a little foolish, particularly those from the conservative side, I suppose, those that weren't necessarily fond of modernist poetry. And indeed, he was accused by others within academia of actually writing the poems himself. Harris was, absolutely. And then suddenly the press got onto this, right? And so the press were involved. They were looking for Banksy here, right? Yeah. They'd identified literature professor and crime writer Michael Innes as the author of the poems. And even student bookmakers started offering odds on the poet's true identity, which I think is quite funny. Ultimately, they traced back via the address that was provided by Ethel to identify who was actually the author of the poem. And as it turns out, it was traced back to the residence of a Sydney poet called Harold Stewart. Within a few days of that, Stewart and his fellow poet James Macaulay came clean. They released a statement admitting they were all behind the hoax. And they were really out to make a point. It's quite cruel, really. Quite cruel, but kind of funny on many other levels. But Macaulay and Stewart are both from ex-military. They said in their statement they believed modernist poetry to be humorless nonsense. And they produced the whole of Ern Malley's tragic life work in one afternoon with the aid of a chance collection of books which happened to be on their desk at the time, which included a concise Oxford dictionary, the collected works of Shakespeare, and a dictionary of quotations. They were out deliberately to devalue modernist poetry. That was all they were trying to do. Their view was modernist poetry was just a really, really bad literary experiment.
Well, I guess they succeeded.
They certainly did. I mean, it's pretty tough on the guys that did the Angry Penguins journal, right? And to make matters worse, for poor old Harris, right, he was involved in some legal action following the publication of his poetry. And the legal action had nothing to do with the fact it was a hoax. Right. The legal action was to do with the fact that the poetry was a bit obscene.
Oh, really?
If you look deeply into the poetry and try to interpret it in certain ways, it could be seen as a bit erotic, which was a bit of a no-no at the time. And he was charged with indecent publication. It was quite funny, and even Harris reflected on this, that this was just ridiculous, that as part of the, I guess, the court case, it was all about looking into the poetry that was published and interpreting what it means. I mean, that's a fool's game, right?
Yeah.
Poetry is very personal. You interpret it, how you need to interpret it. So in order to prove the poems were indecent, immoral, and obscene, they had to find the meanings of the poem. So can you imagine this? The prosecutor delving into that and trying to pull out the rude bits, effectively. So anyway, pretty clear this gentleman was damaged pretty badly by these events. It obviously contributed to the decline of his magazine.
Did he win the case? Or?
No, he lost the case. He was fined £5 and ordered to pay an additional £21 in legal costs, which is probably a couple of $1,000 today or something to that effect. He'd never recovered as a poet, but he continued to have a very successful professional life in academia and other things. Interestingly, Macaulay and Stewart. Macaulay went on to become the founding editor, no surprise here, of conservative literary journal Quadrant. We all know that one, that's still around today. And of course headed up Tasmania's English Literature Department, University of Tasmania. Stewart became a Buddhist scholar and a translator of Japanese haiku. He moved to Japan permanently in 1966. Wow, isn't that incredible? Yeah. And of course, what's interesting is that despite all of this, Ern Malley's poetry has become almost mythical in its status. It's still discussed today. It's been used in music, and it's been the inspiration for a whole range of different sort of artistic endeavours. Albert Tucker said some of the writing was superb, while Sidney Nolan said they gave a new grace to Australian poetry. It's more widely read than the poetry of his creators, so obviously crap poets, and it's inspired a whole range of other artists and writers. And American poet and anthologist David Lehman called Ern Malley the greatest literary hoax of the 20th century. Wow. So a fascinating story, despite it being quite vexatious in the way that they prosecuted this. It's a funny story on many other levels. And this buffoonery that was developed over the course of an afternoon has inspired poets for generations. Quite remarkable. Yeah. So that's the story of Ern Malley.
Almost as if the poets who put it together would obviously possess some kind of innate talent, but it was channeled into rather more traditional conservative areas that probably they weren't naturally suited to. So contrary to their instincts, they were probably obviously better at modernist poetry than they were at anything else.
100%. And, in my mind, I'm viewing this as poetry wars. But look, before we finish, should I read you a little bit of Ern Malley?
Please.
So Ern Malley's got 17 poems, basically, and all of these were published. I'll give you a bit of a sense of the poetry, and you can have a bit of a think about it yourself about whether they're erotic. Are they
quite long poems?
They're middle-sized poems. Most of them are kind of 3 or 4 verses, each of about kind of 6 lines each. Some are a little longer, some are a little shorter. Sure. And I'll leave it up to the listener to interpret whether these are erotic, obscene, or just a bit of a mindless laugh. This is called Bolt to Marina. Only a part of me shall triumph in this. I am not Pericles. Though I have your silken eyes to kiss and maiden knees, part of me remains, wench, bolt upright. The rest of me drops off into the night. What would you have me do? Go to the wars? There's damned deceit. In these wounds thrusts shell holes of the cause, and I'm no cheat. So blowing this lily as trumpet with my lips, I assert my original glory in the dark eclipse. Sainted and schismatic would you be, 4 frowning bedposts will be the cliffs of your wind-thrumbled sea, lady of these coasts. Blown lily, supplice, and stole of Mytilene, you shall rest snug tonight, and know what I mean? You can read that so many different ways. And thrumbled, I've never seen thrumbled used
That's a great word.
Anywhere. I think it's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. You know what? I quite enjoyed that. That was funny.
Yeah, you can certainly hear the Shakespeare in it, can't you?
100%. You can also see why people considered there was obscenity or eroticism woven into that. I mean, in each of the verses, there's clearly elements that you could perceive in all sorts of different ways. Fascinating.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Excellent.
My pleasure. Thank you, Conan.
All right. Let us return to Stella Franklin. The success of My Brilliant Career did not make it easier for her to get published in Australia. Amazingly.
Oh, my God.
And nor did
Seriously.
And nor did it make her rich. Though it was often reprinted, it only sold about...
It didn't make her rich?
It didn't make her rich, no. It was often reprinted, but it only sold about 1,000 copies a year. Most of those were sold in Australia, where the royalties were much less than those she received for the UK sales. By the time she withdrew the book from publication in 1910, it had only earned her £24.
Oh my goodness.
All this probably contributed to her decision to leave Australia in 1906.
She's like, screw you.
Yeah.
I'm out of here. Go somewhere where someone wants to read what I write.
Yeah, although they weren't really reading it in the UK either. But, so she spent the next 20 years mainly in America and Britain and served as a nurse in the Balkans during the First World War. And when she wasn't writing, she devoted most of her time to improving women's rights. In the end, she published 19 books throughout her life, among them the moderately successful Up the Country and All That Swagger. But she is chiefly remembered, of course, for My Brilliant Career. And she died in 1954, bequeathing nearly £9,000 to establish the Miles Franklin Award. So I guess the significance of her was that, she was a feminist when the word did not exist. My Brilliant Career was finally reissued in 1966 as modern feminism was just emerging. And it's been in print ever since. The book's legacy was bolstered, of course, by the film we've just discussed, produced in, I said 1978, it was 1979, at another point in Australian history when a new sense of cultural identity was emerging. So this would have just been in the post-Whitlam era. He made arts funding much more of a priority than any of his conservative predecessors. So it was possible to make films, Australian films, in the 70s, that didn't really exist prior to that. And of course, in the 80s, I assume it was Hawke, introduced the 10VA tax scheme where there was 150% tax write-off on any money invested in the film industry.
Is that right?
So it just
does that continue? I mean,
no,
I'm not expecting you to know that, but yeah.
No, I do know that. It was only in the 1980s.
But it was enough to incentivise the development of a whole range of movies.
Yeah, and it created a lot of films that were absolutely appalling. They were sort of like
Razorback, the giant
Razorback,
pig.
yeah. That's one of the finest wild boar action horror movies ever made. So that's Franklin's legacy. She also has a suburb in Canberra, in this fair city named after her.
Wonderful. Isn't that great?
Had you ever wondered what Franklin was named after?
I have to admit.
You'd given it zero thought.
Zero thought.
So Chris, so that's it for Miles Franklin. Yes?
No, I was going to say a real inspiration, I think. Real inspiration. Writing a novel under those circumstances, being who she was, female, young, coming from the bush, was just brilliant. And to do so at that age, I feel incredibly unsuccessful. At the age of 19, I was stacking shelves at a supermarket. Yeah. So good on her. It's a great story. It really is a great story.
Yeah, and it would be interesting to see what might have happened to her career had she been born a bit later. So, I mean, unfortunately, My Brilliant Career was the peak of her career, really. One could imagine that, if she'd been born 50, 100 years later, the world would have been a bit more receptive to some of her other work. Potentially, I don't know. I mean, maybe the rest of her work wasn't very good.
Can I ask, though, Conan, because you're an author, obviously, yourself. Was your first book autobiographical?
Yeah, I wrote yes, I never even tried to get published. It was so semi-autobiographical, it was embarrassing. It was a book about a travel writer, which I used to be a travel writer. So I thought, well, people want to read about travel writers, sure. So he was a sort of slightly unsavoury...
I knew you were going to say unsavoury.
And he was just sort of, wandering aimlessly around the world, getting into the occasional scrape. Look, maybe if I dragged it out of my bottom drawer, I'd discover it was a work of genius.
But I'm sure some things just need to sit and rest, or sit and fester. I don't know. It depends on
I think anyone who's writing fiction probably just needs to write a first novel and then burn it, and and then I did. It's often the case that your first few books are pretty average, and then
till you find your voice.
Until you find your voice, and you get over yourself a bit and stop writing about your own experience, direct own experiences, and start working up something a bit more original. And accept the fact also that you have to write multiple drafts of that. And that's why it takes so long. I don't know how many drafts Miles Franklin wrote of My Brilliant Career. Sort of sounds like she only wrote one, and then finessed it.
And how does that make you feel?
Inadequate, because my yet to be published book, children's book, I'm on my 12th draft. Yeah.
It's a different world. There are so many people writing. It's so competitive. It's so expensive to get something published on a piece of paper. It's a different world.
Yeah.
There's so many levels. And on top of that, you've got ChatGPT.
Yeah. Chris, for the next episode, you know that I'm interested in Australian identity.
Indeed.
So we're going to be looking at a couple of things. I suppose you could call it, dare I say, a portmanteau episode, where we're going to have a few things in there. 2 pieces of legislation and 2 pieces of nation-building infrastructure. Those bits of I did promise this a couple of episodes ago.
Snowy Hydro?
No. The Trans-Australian Railway and the Telegraph, which connected Australia to the rest of the world.
Great.
The reason I'm sort of putting it in the next episode along with other material is because I don't think they quite justify an episode by themselves. The other material are those 2 bits of legislation, or Legio, as some people call it. Have you ever heard anyone call it that?
People call it Ledge. No one calls it Legio.
Legio.
I work in an environment where everyone works with legislation. People never call it Legio. I've never heard that.
But you've heard it called Ledge?
Yeah.
No, well, it's very Australian, isn't it, doing that to words? But anyway, so the 2 bits of legislation are the Citizenship Act and the Flags Act.
Oh, brilliant.
From the mid-20th century, which helped determine who we are, but it won't be dry, I promise. It's going to be cool.
I look forward to it. As always with these themes that we covered, Conan, you can kind of look at it at all sorts of different levels. When you start digging down, you see there's so much more in the backstory than you would have ever anticipated, I think, which is why we're here doing the podcast.
That's right, yes. Just needling into those little bits of Aussie history, which, as we keep saying, people should know about, but probably don't.
Absolutely. Well, that has been great, Conan. Thank you again. And this is goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me. Until next time.